welcome to Get Even, the podcast for ambitious women looking to go further. I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, and your host for this episode today. Get Even is a podcast where we interview successful women about their career stories, but we actually take a peek behind the curtain. So we learn about what it really takes to thrive. We learn about some of the hard choices that they've had to make in their careers. We learn about the messy realities behind the highlights reel. And if you're a woman who's got a lot on her plate, who wants to go far and who wants community and support, then this is the place for you. Welcome to Get Even. Today's conversation is one I've really been looking forward to sharing with you. I'm joined by my dear friend and leadership expert, Laura Sturt-Addicott. Laura is an organization psychologist. She's an expert in leadership, culture, executive assessment, and digital cultures. She's held roles at ANZ, Ramsay, and Westpac. This conversation is perfect if you're on a leadership path and you're looking to progress. Laura talks us through how organizations assess and select high potential leaders, including at executive and CEO levels. She also tackles common leadership challenges, such as starting well with a new team that you've inherited, delegating well and holding teams accountable for performance, and communicating change. One of the things I love most in this chat is Laura's encouragement to us all to start a leadership path with an examination of what we really want internally, what matters to us, what our values are, what we want our lives outside of work to look like, and to not choose leadership for external reasons. So let's say if you're one of the women on the Even platform, and let's imagine if you'd been identified as high potential and perhaps ready for your next role. Could be just the next level of leadership where you're going from, having your own small team to perhaps leading a division or leading several teams. So my question to you is, what habits would you advise the women who are in that position to start developing now? But just what do you think sets somebody up for a longer term leadership pathway?
I actually think it needs to be that slightly bigger question, because it works really well if you can start holistically from the whole person. And I actually really recommend somebody thinking about starting by defining, what does success look like for them? So what is it if you are going to be successful in your career and your life more broadly? So that's really considering everything that's important to you. What is it about your health? What is it about your relationships? What is it about your wealth? What is it about things that you do with your free time that are important to you? Really being clear on what success actually looks like for you, rather than perhaps sometimes what happens is what's been ingrained from childhood or from society or heritage factors, but starting with you and what you want and what that is and what that means to be successful means that then you can set the boundaries to create the habits from. So health is a really key value and driver for you in being successful. Then what is it that means you need to put the habit in now? So you have a boundary and a habit and a routine around that no matter how senior you get and how high potential you are, that's a foundation of what's core to you. I think it helps because that high potential is a great label to have, but I've also seen those who have been high potential or been senior or got towards the end of their careers. And if they have too much of a narrow lens or focus on it, we see more burnout. We see people towards the end of their career realizing that they don't have a broader sense of purpose or why. And this way enables you to get ahead of a lot of that and to set those habits and boundaries. And then I think the only other piece I would say is a high potential in terms of that role component is I'd actually get into a habit of asking for feedback. So you can, as you become more senior, get less direct feedback. People are slightly less, not that they're not honest, but they're less willing to give you that feedback directly. So as a high potential, amazing that you've been identified at that. But why? What is it that people see as your strengths? What is it that you could work on in terms of your development? Or if you know the kind of roles you want to get to, what are the experiences you need? Because it's not just capabilities, it's also sometimes exposure and experience and mentoring that's going to help you along the way. So a couple of components that I'd take to it if I was talking to the people who've been identified as high potential.
Amazing. And I completely also agree with you on the aspect around feedback. I think it's
Mm.
incredible if you're in that position where you've been identified as high potential. Maybe you're on a program, maybe you're surrounded by a program or an initiative that gives you that feedback or collects it for you. But I think, especially if you're in a leadership practice and you've got your teams, one of the habits that I developed over time was whenever there was a development conversation with direct reports, it also, there was a component where it was, okay, it's time for you to give me my developmental feedback for what do I need to do between now and the next conversation to actually be better equipped to be a leader to you. And that was quite confronting at times. But you're right. I think if people don't, if you don't ask them, the more senior you are, the less likely you are to actually get some honest, constructive feedback. People are not going to go out of their way to deliver it to you.
Absolutely. And even as a high potential, you can start to have had a bit of that halo effect put on you. And therefore, sometimes only the good stuff is pointed out or some of that feedback is not given in the same way. So it really is a great habit to build. And I love that you did that with your direct reports, no matter how confronting it is. Sometimes you need to pause and take a breath and listen to it, and then you can move forward with it.
And I could feel my heart sort of beating in my chest when you asked that question. And it's like, even though I've prepared myself and they always knew it was coming, I would also let them know in writing. It's still, you kind of go, what am I about to hear? But that's just, yeah, it's very normal and natural. I actually want to go deeper into that personal stuff with you. So given that, as an organizational psychologist, you've done a lot of work as a coach, as somebody who's assessed CEOs and successors, as a consultant, when you've done the more personal work with leaders, and especially very senior leaders, what do you think many of us don't know about these leaders? But if we did, it would actually help us to make these roles and these people less intimidating.
It's a really interesting question. And it brings me back to actually it's something that surprised me once. I was once given the feedback after a meeting with some really senior leaders of, oh, you weren't intimidated during that meeting. And I remember being surprised, like, oh, was I meant to be? Like I hadn't really realized it. And what it came down to is I spent a lot of time with them, to your point. And so I think I'd really already realized that they are also humans. And as overly simplistic as that sounds, they have had great success in their careers, but they've also had failures. They've had setbacks. They have dealt with the difficult things in life that you and I and others have dealt with in life. And sometimes we forget that, when we put someone on a pedestal in a leadership role at times, we can think, well, why aren't they saying this in the most perfect way? Or, maybe they're hard to talk to, but actually we can connect with them in a way that really, let's just start off with fundamentally, they have won, they have lost, they have dealt with many difficult things. And, some aren't always as open about the struggles that they've had or the difficulties or those failures. We tend to talk about the things that have gone well versus those that haven't. And so we might not always know that. So I would start with the fact that actually fundamentally they've been through many of the things that you've been through. And the other component I'd say is there's often a recognition that they may not be as close to a problem or an issue or to the customer as other people in the organization. And they're often a lot more open to hearing about what's going on in reality than people might think. So if you
Mm.
have insight or ideas or you're seeing patterns in the organization that they might not see because they're too far removed, they often really want to hear that. It can be off-putting because they're used to hearing information in a certain way, concise, clear. They ask a lot of questions. But the core of it is that they want to know what's going on. They want to know what that felt experience is like to work in the organization. They want to know what customers are saying. They want to understand that. So they actually want to hear from you more than you think they might want to hear from you.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic advice. And even though it might be intimidating, like you said, they're just people. And actually, we've got valuable things to offer, valuable insights. And also, at the core of it, like you said, they've had wins, they've had losses. So, Laura, you've developed thousands of leaders and you've been at the forefront of assessing leaders for some of the biggest roles of their careers, such as CEO roles. Now, what are some of the key aspects that tell you whether someone is ready for once in a career role?
I think it's a really fascinating question because I have been really lucky to assess, as you said, like literally thousands of leaders, but also globally. So not just one region or another, but to see that variance globally. There really are some consistent pieces that do come up. But there's also a couple of points that are critical that sometimes surprisingly get overlooked. And that's some of the contextual components of the role, for example. So, what do I mean by that? So, quite often, organizations and businesses, they don't actually have as strong a view on what the future, say 3 years plus, looks like than they think they might do. So when we think about, okay, well, what kind of CEO do you need or what executive do you need? What's the context of that role? What's the vision for the future? What's the strategy for the future? And what is needed from that executive or from that CEO to be successful? So the context is actually a really critical point to start with. And if I'm to really simplify that down, that can be the difference between a leader who might be phenomenal in a transformation or a turnaround situation, but actually may not thrive or be at their best at a business as usual or needing to decrease a part of the business, for example. So that contextual piece is probably something that's really important. The other is actually people can end up in, for development reasons or succession reasons, end up in assessments and nobody actually even asks them if they want that role. Which sounds odd, I realize, but the motivation of the person themselves is also really important. What does that person want next in their career? What is that staging for it? I was running a CEO succession program. And one of the executives, for example, that have been put forward, very high potential, but they didn't want the CEO role in the next 1 year. They'd only recently been moved into the executive. They wanted to be able to have time and space to really deliver on some key components. So there's also a motivational piece. So the future strategy, a motivational aspect, and then we get into things like what are some of those capabilities? So what are those key aspects? Now, we could write a book on this in terms of all of the different things that you look for in assessment. Is somebody ready or not? But there's probably a few areas that really stand out. So one of the ones that comes up quite often is around that level of strategic thinking, enterprise mindset, and combined with that decision making. Even when executive role going into considering a CEO role. I coached a CFO, for example, who really wanted to be considered for the CEO role, but kept being told that they weren't ready yet or that they weren't considered CEO material. It wasn't nice, clear, crisp feedback, but we worked through what was happening. And what we identified was that every time they were having conversations with the CEO or at the executive table, they were bringing solely the financial lens to those conversations and to the organization. And when they identified, yes, okay, I see, I'm only talking about this narrow component versus thinking more broadly and holistically about the whole business or not speaking on parts where they thought it wasn't their area of expertise, they struggled to be seen as somebody who could then take on that broader role. And we see this at every kind of level and stage of leadership transition, that ability to step out perhaps your subject matter expertise and area into broader, or even within your own business unit and consider maybe I have to step back from what's important to the business unit here to actually go, what's the greater benefit to the organization? And can they demonstrate some of those pieces?
Yeah, wow.
Decision making comes into it in terms of the balance of decision making. So, yes, there's a component around your capability and ability to make decisions. You're going too analytical, too intuitive, and understanding what are the decisions where you need to go deeper and what are the decisions where you need to go quickly and move forward. And equally, what are those decisions that you need to delegate and let go of? The decision making component is a core piece in terms of some of that readiness for role. I really like if you come across the Amazon framing of two-way door and one-way door in terms of decision making.
No.
So they have this principle around, okay, is a decision a two-way door or a one-way door? I.e., two-way doors, you can walk through it, you can try something, you can test it, but you can come back again. A one-way door is something that's very hard or very costly or almost impossible to come back from. Firing someone, for example, not really something that you can come back from once you've made that decision. And then there are obviously bigger, broader business decisions that are like that. So where are the ones where you can experiment and where are the ones where you need to perhaps deliberate and take time?
I think you've highlighted some of the key tensions around. I mean, it was actually really interesting just to hear about the context, that the context matters, that things like the motivation really matters, but then also some of the key capabilities that you need to develop if you're stepping up into CEO. And I think the differences also between an executive role versus having responsibility for a whole of an enterprise.
Well, actually, do you know what? Some people have done this and they said there's at least 45 capabilities, but I reckon there are probably 6 really critical ones that come up. So also stakeholder and influence, the ability to deliver and execute, and then that adaptability and kind of being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
So Laura, one of the things that I really love when I speak to you is the fact that I always find it easier when I have time with you to actually make sense of my own setbacks, my own challenges, my own wins and losses, because you are a reflection partner to me. But I'm going to sort of turn it on you today. And I want to ask you, in the career that you've had some absolutely massive wins. You've had some big roles. You've also faced your own fair share of setbacks, difficult moments. How do you work through those trying career moments and how do you make sense of them?
I think exactly to that point we were just talking about, every career has these ups and downs within it. There is very rarely a career which just goes in one direction without some bump in the road that you may not have been anticipating or expecting. I think the biggest thing that I really work on for myself, and don't get me wrong, sometimes it takes me time to get here, but is I actually genuinely believe that everything that happened, those ups or downs or those different roles or things changing that I wasn't expecting, I've really learned or grown from those components. And like I said, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to be able to step back and reflect and go, okay, what was situational? What was other people? Not taking on everything that happened, but what can I do? What can I learn? And what can I develop as a result of this? What's important for me to grow so that I can kind of get the best from even something that may have been traditionally seen as a failure by others? What can I take from it? And also, we sometimes don't realize the gifts that a role has given us until later in our career. Even a good role, when we're in it, we don't realize how much we're learning or what we're exposed to. It's only in that reflection that we can go, oh my goodness, this has enabled me to do so much more than I thought. Or the other component in terms of realizing what a role has given you later in your career, I hadn't realized that some of the roles that I'd done where I had spent that time assessing leaders, what it had enabled me to do later. It enabled me to be in those rooms and have those conversations in a way that I felt comfortable and confident, that without that exposure and experience, I may not have been as comfortable and confident in that room. But in the middle of it, in the middle of doing the assessment work and spending the time with leaders, I didn't realize that that was a muscle that it was building. So sometimes these things you can only really get the true benefit from on reflection and looking back as well.
So let's get tactical about some of the leadership wisdom that you hold. But let's imagine that you're working with somebody who's just been promoted into a challenging new role. So it could be, maybe they're taking on a division that's disengaged, or maybe they're taking on a team or a division or they're being tasked with assembling a new division from scratch, which is also a beautiful assignment. But what are some of the first things that they should do from a people perspective to start well? So what are some of the important leadership practices and rhythms that you would want to share with our members on Even?
Yeah, so I think really the first place I would start, even when thinking a bit broader than the people, is really understanding that current state. So it's a bit of a classic, but what actually are you inheriting? Because sometimes it's a bit like when you take on a new role, there's a job description and then there's the reality of that job. And sometimes they differ, not for anything other than people don't know everything that's going on until you get in there and uncover it. So what's the current state? What data can you get out? Whether that's kind of financial data, performance data, people data, culture data. What do you have that's going to give you insight into that current reality? And either understanding if it is a team that's underperforming or unengaged, what is that future state meant to look like, or co-creating with your leadership team what that future state you want to be if you're setting something up for the first time. Then we've got a classic of going, okay, where am I now? Where do I need to go to in the future? And it helps with anchoring, because it can feel overwhelming when you step into a role and going, okay, what's really going on here? And just how far and how long will it take to get to where we need to be thriving? So I'd start with those components, and then from that, really getting clear on that vision, that why, linking it up to the larger strategy of the organization, but really making it sound for the team and for your department. What are you there to do? And if it's about a motivation situation and a turnaround, how can you then use that as a bit of that classic light on the hill to really inspire people? Within that, engaging and understanding your leadership team is going to be really critical. And then I would say build from there. So team alignment sessions, really spending the time and dedicating that time to thinking about, how is this team going to work? How are we really going to work together? How are we going to build trust? How are we going to do all the classic things of a high performing team, and not just in a one-off, one day offsite? Because this is a trap that people fall into. I tick the box. We did a team development session. Okay, no, you can't just do that once a year, once every 6 months. What do you need in terms of that rhythm? Are you at a minimum once a quarter spending time with your people, really discussing the people side of components and focusing on that future why, focusing on the strategy, focusing on alignment, and then embedding those habits into more of the weekly or daily rituals that you have as a team? Again, so it's consistent rather than solely a tick the box exercise. So that consistency is really key with your team. And from a people perspective, it depends how broad you want to go. So if you're thinking about having a department and needing to have a cascading impact of a culture or a turnaround or establishing a new, what are the symbols of that culture that you're trying to create? What is something that you could implement or change or set up that really shows that you're serious about that future state and how to get there? Have you got a visitor? I can start again at any point. You're good. Are you good?
She doesn't want to say hi. Okay.
No, not really, Mum. No, not interested.
So, what you were on the cultural symbols. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, then we're starting to move into culture change territory, which is probably another book or podcast or episode. But generally speaking, in terms of the people practices, when we're thinking about shifting components, there's a real need for role modeling and consistently communicating about that future state, why decisions are being made, linking it back to that, and inspiring and engaging along the way.
Okay. Big topic, like you said, but I think there's some really good wisdom in there around some of the basics and around how do you lead people, but also I think you described the turnaround situation really beautifully, and the just what is required in terms of the consistency, what's required in like repetition, in making sure that you've got the right leadership team in place, and that you're really clear on what you actually need to achieve. I'm just wondering, is there anything else from a more day-to-day leadership practices that, like, if somebody's, I mean, this is kind of a different scenario now, it's not taking on a department or a division, but what if somebody is looking to reinvigorate their leadership game per se? What are some of the basics of good leadership that, like, are there any other additions that you would recommend?
I think this is interesting as well, because even at really senior levels, some of the basics are not always there, and we think that they are there, but they are not there. We forget some of the pieces as well. So to that point about communication that we were talking about earlier, for example, there's often a piece that at a leadership level, you may have discussed an idea, a change, for example, as to how you're going to drive the business going forward. You may have discussed it multiple times, and people forget that that's the first time that those people that you're communicating to are hearing this new idea. And you've got this level of knowledge and insight, and you've processed through the change that potentially they haven't. So the communication piece is one that is often missed. Again, it is a bit of a cliche that over communicate, but really there is a case that you do need to communicate a lot more than you think you do. So those are kind of pieces, but practical everyday leadership components that come into it in terms of, are you holding people accountable? So this is probably perhaps more on the turnaround or even trying to stretch to new levels as well. But often like in delegation or lack of delegation or truly holding people accountable in a way that's respectful and, you set the goals and pieces together.
Accountability is obviously a big topic, but what would you have to do in order to just set some basic rhythms around accountability?
So the rhythms really are you actually truly delegating and setting accountability on what the task even is? Are people clear that they are the owner of it? Quite often you get people going, I thought they were doing it. I thought they were doing it. Hang on, are you doing it? So who is accountable for that? And then setting those pieces together. Okay, how are we going to check in on this? What do you need from me to remove barriers or roadblocks? When can we discuss the progress on this? And checking in. You can find that if you've got a team of high potentials, you set and forget. And even those who are high potentials and driving really well, seeing where things are before they've gone too far down a path can really help you as a leader be able to perhaps course correct or offer advice or suggestions along the way.
Yeah. Great. I think that's really, really practical. So let's move from some of the leadership insight into personal career advice. And I want to ask you about some of your favorite career advice that you've received, or perhaps you've received some career advice that you want others to just ignore.
Yes, we probably could do a whole topic on this and it'd be quite ranging as well. I actually think I would say that with career advice in general, I would start with going back to the most important thing is understanding what it means to you and what's important to you. So career development actually means very different things to different people. For some people, they do think of it as that continuous progression upwards, but for many, it's not that. It might be around making a real difference in a topic or an area or an industry, something that you're passionate about, and that's important as part of your career development, or even to that point around what is success for you. So actually, I would start with the most useful career advice being pausing and figuring out what you want, not what others want or not what others expect of you. Because otherwise you can get into a bit of that perpetual cycle of going, okay, this role, then this role, then this role, and then realizing actually this is not necessarily where I want to be or what actually is right for me. So understanding what that means for you as an individual is probably the most important first step. The other is actually that you don't always know where you are. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you don't always realize how good you are at something or how far along you have come in your journey over your career already. We can get really stuck as humans at certain points of time, and we end up telling ourselves a bit of a narrative, a story about who we are, the kinds of roles that we can take, the kinds of careers that we can have. And actually spending time to kind of update your narrative about who you are now and what you can do, even just asking yourself, what can I do today that I couldn't 2 years ago? And going, oh gosh, okay, actually I'm further along in some things than I thought I was. So it would be remiss of me if I didn't say that getting a coach would be beneficial. But generally, I've actually recently had some coaching again, and it really helps when you're stuck or when you're not sure what that next step is, or when you're not sure how to find a progression path forward, is how can you get people to support you in identifying perhaps what you are great at, or where you are now, or what you do want, or what is important to you as well. So those are the pieces that I would take. The pieces of advice that I wouldn't take, I feel like these are the ones that my husband said I shouldn't go into.
Come on. Let's have it.
Well, unfortunately, the pieces of career advice that I've had that I wouldn't want people to listen to and take are the ones which really at the foundations, they've got an element of discrimination to them. So, they're other people's biases, they're other people's limitations, other people's expectations, things around whether you do or don't have children and how that may impact your career. That's their issue. That's not my issue. That's not your issue. If you know what you want from life holistically, and you know where you want to take your career and you want to take your life more broadly, that's the kind of stuff you just need to go, no shush. No, thank you. For your advice, I'm good. So it's more when it's other people's lens or other people's bias where I go, you don't need to take that. And the other one that came up the other day is even generational. So what does a generational difference look like in terms of career advice? The idea that, my parents at one point, I remember my dad being like, 4 years in that role and you're going to change? Yeah, I'm changing course. They've got a new job. It took a while to get used to the fact that careers have changed, roles have changed. The typical role, saw on the other day, I think the average is about 2 to 2.5 years long in role. That's very normal. And that's a elder millennial take on it, right? You talk to somebody in a different generation, they'll be telling you, what are you even talking about like this for? We do it differently again. So what is important to you is probably the most important piece. And then the rest we can ignore.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for adding the bits that you ignore, because I actually think that's also very real. And it does happen. And there's so much about just knowing yourself and trusting what's important to you, that a lot of it is just noise. And like you said, it's other people's perceptions. It's their way of making sense. It's, it's their lens, as you put it, which is great. So last question from one geriatric millennial to an elder millennial.
I feel cooler as an elder.
The things we hang on to. Okay. So why is it a great idea for women to have access to a community like Even?
I think this boils down to what I love about Even is there really is, for me, it's a platform that's non-judgmental. So you can bring all of you into the conversations that you're having, what you're learning, what you're going through. There are people who've gone through the same, perhaps, piece of advice that you need to ignore as well. We were just talking about with careers, the people who've gone through the juggle are thinking about the juggle, thinking about what they want from their life more broadly. And there isn't a judgment if you bring all of you. So I don't think any more or less of you professionally because you've got something going on outside of work. You are you. And I think you're amazing at what you're doing, because I know that you're on the platform. So you've already been identified as someone who's got potential. So brilliant. We take away any need for the judgment. We know these women are awesome. There's awesome women on the platform, and therefore you can be you. So you have that ability to be safe and to be vulnerable. And at the same time, really learn and discuss critical things that are going to help you to be successful in the future. What are those topics that perhaps you really want to learn more about, or really want to know, or know are important for the future? We think about some of the digital components that are going on that perhaps leading up to a more traditional program or platform where it is overly male dominated, or you a little bit hesitant about perhaps asking the question that you're unsure of. You've got that space where you're free to ask that question, and you're surrounded by a lot of people who will go, oh yeah, I wanted to know that too. So I've forgotten your original question and how you framed it, but for me, it's just really important to have a space where you can be authentic, you can learn, you can grow, and you're not judged.
Amazing. Thank you. Laura, it's been a pleasure interviewing you. I've been very lucky to have you in my life. Thank you so much for this interview.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Nora.
I'm Dr. Nora Koslowski, co-founder of Even, where our mission is to accelerate women's economic potential. Check out even-careers.com to learn how we support women and business to get even.